Hello, I am Son of Spectre. I am about level 300 in Tower Heroes, and this video is going over my current opinion on the meta in Tower Heroes. I have compiled this tier list based on my general experiences and how I feel about the towers, plus input from other people. This tier list will rank heroes based on a few factors. How good they are in most situations, and special exceptions are made if a hero is niche but very effective at that situation. This tier list mainly aims at higher levels of play with brief mentions of new players, random servers, and soloing for ranking. It assumes you already have most of the towers, although if you're a newer player, you can use this as a guide on what to buy and use. Heroes are ranked based on them being used properly, with improper usage partially considered, and max potential is considered, but it's not the end-all be-all. The order of heroes listed does matter slightly. First in line is just good enough to potentially be the tier above, but falls short and vice versa. If you watched my hero review videos, those were mostly ranked in isolation, and they don't reflect the ranking in this video one-to-one. And also, this is just my opinion. This video has gone under review and suggestions were made by a lot of my friends, many of which are also high levels, but my opinion is still the final say. I'll also include the full tier list at the end of the video if you're impatient. Let's start with the first and obvious option, Spectre. He is the definitive support of this game, and your loadout will pretty much always have him, as he simply doubles the damage. And if you want even more damage, just pop the ability for 10,000 mana for a 25% rate boost. Spectre is so insane and embedded into my head that I unconsciously double the damage and DPS of every tower whenever I read the stats and whatnot. Spectre is the first tower you should get. Period. Now that we got the obvious best tower out of the way, we are going in order of the worst to best heroes. C tier is for towers that are below average and are easily replaced. While they might prove useful in some moments, those moments are few and far between to consider legitimate usage. Jester. He is an RNG tower, being able to give effects to multiple enemies and summons, spawn random enemies on either side, and give or take mana. Even his price is randomized, averaging out to be one of the most expensive heroes. The odds are slightly in your favor, however, and with his expensive price, it's pretty hard to actually lose because of Jester. You're more likely to lose because of his expensive price if you max him early. Jester gets the lowest spot because he's RNG incarnate, and the few situations he can come in clutch with, there's a tower that does just that. Mako. He's a melee hero with a charge-up gimmick. There's basically no reason to use him, and it's just better to use towers that have dedicated roles, like Bite, Goblino, Chef, or Frank. I made an entire video detailing why he's so bad. If you bring a tower to prevent leaking, then you might as well reconsider your actual strategy. Wafer, the Christmas hero, mediocre damage and a gimmick that doesn't even encourage anything half the time. C tier. He also flip-flops between being overpowered and being borderline useless, which gives even less reason to use him. Quinn. She is a long-range hero, and despite having a support slow ability, she still doesn't have that much usage. She does mediocre damage, and levels before max are even worse, and it just leads to her being borderline placebo in a lot of cases, and you're basically required to maximize Quinn's range usage to get the bare minimum of damage. She's right behind B tier for this reason. This is the entirety of C tier. B tier is for the baseline heroes. Heroes are ranked generally according to this tier, and in my opinion should be the first few heroes you get and try to use, as they are used in a lot of strategies, random matches, and generally don't require that much attention or coordination, and are basically just interchangeable with each other. Ironically, starting with Nuki, their main role is to be a slot filler tower, and you do get decent value, especially when you're able to stack up a lot of Nukis in one spot, as one Nuki does as much damage as a Yasuke, with theoretically no limit and basically infinite range. But the big takeaway is that if you want to max out Nuki, you'd have to build your strategy around them, and unlike Stella, you can't heal the Nukis, so keeping them alive is a delicate balance between letting them attack and not letting them attack. There's other slot filler towers that have more utility and are just easier to use and get more value. Slime King. He is the most basic summoner, being obtained from the first map you complete. He's decent early game if you get level 3 early on, and the effect provides nice DPS. Being the most basic summoner, he's easily outclassed and his abilities are hardly useful, and most strategies with him is mostly the other towers doing the heavy lifting, with Slime King just there to do janitorial work. For new players he can be sort of helpful, but in actual coordinated matches he's kinda falls off. Sparks Kilowatt. She's a basic DPS tower, but her gimmick doesn't really do much, and she still does the same damage as Scientist, just spread across 8 slots, which is just worse. There isn't really much of a reason to use Sparks unless you really need to use her spacing, or something, I don't know. And she's just outclassed, and her ability doesn't save her at all. B tier. Fracture, pretty meh tower, high limit and extremely large footprint compared to the range and limit. Early game is slightly better, but there isn't really much of a reason you should use him besides that. Scientist, she is the most basic tower and is probably the first tower you get as a starter. There isn't really anything wrong with Scientist as she's consistent and is able to fit in a lot of loadouts due to her low limit. There isn't really anything truly wrong with Scientist. The big problem is her massive footprint, which is helped by the fact her limit is low and the range makes up for it. B tier. Oddport is a very map-dependent summoner. If you have a short path with no alternate paths, then Oddport is a pretty good early game summoner with the ability to deal direct damage and have multiple lives on level 3. The factors limiting it are only one Oddport can spawn per tower, limiting the DPS on longer maps, and outright killing the tower if it doesn't go the wrong path. And the lack of scaling limits the late game potential. Oddport is an alright tower that does what they are meant to do, but it doesn't do much past that. This is the entirety of B tier. A tier is similar to the previous tier, but these heroes generally have something going for them that makes them a little more desirable, such as splash damage, high range, or notable early game potential. Dumpster Child. He is a very strong early game tower, being super cost effective and is able to deal damage to multiple enemies at once and having decent mid to late game crowd control due to Dumpster Child stacking, even more so when paired with a Spectre, which makes damage add up very quickly. The big problem is that he's somewhat inconsistent and he can easily miss enemies if they're too fast or there's too many at once, which makes when and where you place him very important. If you can get around these areas, he's actually pretty good. He can, however, be substituted by other DPS towers and crowd control options, especially if early game isn't strong enough to demand Dumpo Maitake. Bebo, a long-range, high DPS tower being able to move around the map. This tower is a really solid pick for multi-lane maps like Hideaway Hive and Silent Sanctuary. The biggest drawback is that it's inconsistent on normal maps, and for Silent and Hideaway, you could get away with using other DPS towers. He's still a really solid option, which puts him at A tier. Soda Pop is a splash hero and he can be used for early game due to his cheap price and splash damage and be a pretty decent way to deal with large crowds in the endgame while also dealing decent boss damage. He however attacks pretty slow. Branch. Same idea as Soda Pop, but more consistent due to him having larger range and a faster attack rate, meaning his splash is a lot more reliable, even though it is a lot smaller. It borders personal preference, but I'd have to say Branch is still better. Keith. He's an interesting tower. He throws a boomerang which penetrates enemies and does return damage, and this return damage doesn't suffer from damage fall off, meaning he's a really consistent crowd control tower if you get the right placements, which is actually quite common due to how large his boomerang hitbox is and its small range. He's also one of the cheapest heroes in the game, and he's the entire reason you're able to solo Gleaming Garden, and he also makes Oddport Academy solo pretty easy too. If you're able to use Keith effectively, he's honestly a really good and cheap tower. Karkid is objectively the best summoner. If you max him early, he's able to bridge the gap between early and mid very effectively and can chip down stronger enemies and clean up after dump or other towers, especially on longer maps. And in the late game, if you have discount dog ability, you can very quickly get a lot of Karkids to deal really nice chip damage on the boss. His biggest issue is that he's basically useless until level 5 and he has a pretty slow spawn rate, meaning he can't do mid game as effectively on short term or multi-lane maps, and he's only really useful after you start spamming him in late game. Easily still the best summoner out of the 3 and it's not even close. Maitake, an effect tower similar to Dump, having insanely cost-efficient first levels. Placing all 4 Maitakes across the map, each of them doing 80 damage each, and having built-in hidden detection and stun immunity is enough to secure early game on a lot of maps. With the additional ability to unstun towers at level 4 being able to make the difference between defeating a boss and not, or even mild stuff like Bombies or even tricky waves like Starseers. Maitake is a really good support tower, however her mid to late game is fairly limited due to level 4 through 5 cost efficiency is insanely bad, so you might as well not even get level 5 Maitake because they're just not worth it in the slightest. A tier. Bunny, basically comparable to pre-nerf Scientist when it comes to pricing and damage output. With that comes somewhat alright early game usage. Nothing really bad about them, besides the ability not really doing as much to the net DPS and basically nerfing the tower more than buffing the tower, but it's still a really good DPS option. Voka, insane range, insane splash damage, making her versatile on pretty much every map from Hideaway Hive and Silent Sanctuary like Bebo, or Castletown and Corporate Chaos like Scientist. Level 2 also has a little utility to chip down a strong enemy in the early game. She's a really solid damage support option, which makes her A tier. Lure, basically doing what Fracture was probably meant to be doing, but actually good, and it's one of the only towers to have built-in stun immunity. Pair that with a very situational ability that makes him able to target multiple enemies at once. They are a decent tower. The ability can be pretty helpful for crowds, but it can't replace crowd control towers you already have due to its price being out of reach until late game, and the ability is basically worthless if you plan on bringing Frank. A tier. Also A tier because to people who think he's S tier because he was used once in Relentless Reflections and Destiny's Dawn because, I don't know, someone said he was good would take my kidneys. This is all the towers in A tier. I believe this tier does have a lot of contentious spots and some towers might be swapped around, but I'm satisfied. S tier are for towers that are exceptionally strong, but need a strategy to be built around them, or towers that contribute heavily to a match with little effort. While you can use these towers in random matches, their potential is limited due to lack of coordination. First on the list is Stella. She's ranked very highly in pretty much every tier list, and that's mainly taking from her max potential, which is perfectly reasonable. The effort it takes to get max potential Stella isn't that intuitive, but if you're not trying to do max potential Stella, why are you even using Stella in the first place? Stella by herself is pretty alright. The snow minion is basically a free level 4 bite without the worry of a cooldown and a decently long duration if you get one on each side of her range, and the only thing stopping you is the min-max thing before, and the fact it's difficult to get that specific setup, and microing is similar to Goblino micro, aka placing her and praying she places a drawing in time. The other drawings are basically on par with actual towers with zero worry for the limit and the ability to refuel their health, and not really needing to deviate from standard placement strategies too much, unlike Nuki. It's pretty easy to get the max potential because of that. The biggest drawback is that it's basically impossible to use her outside of solo and maybe duo if you're really coordinated. Basing in trio and quad doesn't really allow for Stella to be used, not to mention that if you forget to heal the drawings, you lose all your DPS, and chances are she's the only DPS you have. Wizard. Similar to Stella being an extremely high DPS option, but Wizard is a lot more consistent and doesn't require much upkeep, making it extremely good for solos, duos, and trios. The cost is over 3 times the average DPS tower just for under 3 times the damage, so the cost efficiency is pretty bad, but the main draw is that all your DPS is focused onto a single slot, so you can bring supports and maybe even more DPS in that extra slot. The main issue with Wizard is that as you get more players, the harder it is to max out Wizard and the less practical he becomes, as it's just better to bring normal DPS towers anywhere above duo. Wizard is still low S tier though. Buzzer. Extremely strong single target damage that gets an insane boost from discount dog due to a low limit. There isn't really anything wrong with her. She also has a very situational splash damage which only really exists to punish bombies, as it's very hard to make her consistently use her splash damage. Plus, Maitake makes it even worse due to it being on death only. She also has an ability that gives a stackable splash damage effect to every summon on the map, which when paired with an extremely strong summon like Slime King ability, easily racks up a lot of damage into a nuke for a boss. Although it's very expensive and because of that it's hard to execute in an actual game, she's still S tier. Haze. A tower similar to Buzzer, but with the benefit of infinite range giving it even more cost efficiency and more DPS when paired with Discount Dog. Haze is ridiculously easy to use, simply place him and he does damage across the entire map, especially to the boss, making him a really good slot filler tower. He also doesn't need Maitake to be good, although it doesn't hurt the user and it does boost your DPS. Haze is just insanely easy to use, just place it and wait for it to deal insane damage and you can use him basically anywhere. S tier. Volt. Close range area damage tower with the ability to increase their own range, making them able to be used as a DPS tower, making them a jack of all trades. The biggest problem is that it's kind of below average for early game besides level 2 Volt, although it does pick up late game with the Volt points. With the correct setup, he can be all the DPS you need in a map when soloing, especially on longer maps and raid maps. Volt is an extremely versatile tower, being able to sub in for a DPS, crowd control, early game support, There's a few circumstances where Vault is preferred over Frank. Vault is S tier. Chef, an extremely basic tower doing high DPS with low range. You can't go wrong with using Chef. Melee towers benefit a lot from stunner towers as they can use their high DPS for longer. He's also pretty cost effective to max out, making him alright as leak protection for early game enemies, or as your main source of damage for early game, especially when you get supports down and you spam him. Yasuke, not that much different from Chef, and they're damn near on par, but Yasuke does better in solo runs and does early game a bit better than Chef due to attacking a lot faster while only being slightly more expensive, but that extra price is worth it. He also gains a Dragon Flame ability for 3k mana, which boosts his stats to do almost double the DPS, which when paired with summoners is pretty good, I'd say. Yasuke is generally better for solo runs and if less people use him, because Dragon Flame ability gets more and more expensive the more you use it, alongside having a slightly bigger footprint and smaller range. Chef and Yasuke are about damn near on par. Hot Dog Frank, easily the most meta tower. Getting max Franks is enough to carry on pretty much every map till the final wave, especially when supported by Bite, as he's just a 20k HP wall. He can also do early game a lot better than Vault due to him being cheaper, having a bit more range, and relying on burst damage. It's pretty easy to just max him and let him carry till the final wave, and he can also deal alright chip damage to the boss. He's used in pretty much every strategy on any semi-hard map for this reason. Bite, a very basic stunner tower. He is able to fortify your defenses against faster and stronger enemies, and can come in clutch to defend the back line. Additionally able to support against bosses and was basically required for any difficult boss. But you can't rely on him to stun every enemy at once, only stragglers due to his slow cooldown and expensive price. So it's difficult to use him for enemy spam, especially when there is only one Bite. This is all the towers in S tier. Now onto the big three. You already know why you're here, let's get right into it. Balloon Pal is a very simple support, increases range by 50% and has a backup ability that deals 7,000 damage to a leaking enemy. Despite being so simple, Balloon Pal just makes everything easier. Towers hit more and cover more paths on large maps. Supports affect more towers, making placement easier and less tight on spacing. Discount Dog has a pretty small range which helps a lot. It also affects the splash radius of towers. It's very easy to take Balloon Pal's effects for granted. Discount Dog's benefits are a lot more tangible. He's able to trivialize mid-game by cutting the price of every tower, including supports, in half, and the ability gives a huge damage boost, especially with lower limit towers and higher player counts. Both are very close in power. I personally rank Discount Dog higher than Balloon Pal, but Balloon Pal generally has more use. Discount Dog falls off in solo because you don't need the price increase that bad, and the ability is hard to use due to the lack of mana. Balloon Pal is almost required. Discount Dog vs Balloon Pal is pretty ambiguous, so choose which one you like more, I guess. Lemonade Cat, it's free money, it's obvious why it's S tier. This is the entire tier list. Remember, if you don't like this ranking, blame my friends, and this video is satire when I say it is. Feel free to like and subscribe, it tells me you want more of this stuff.